Good evening. Those of you who are dedicated partisans of royalty, American style, will be very familiar with that engaging ceremony known as induction into the Hollywood Walk of Fame, when stars, having attained a certain measure of celebrity, usually measured in dollars on account of their film performances, have a star allocated to them along the Hollywood boulevards. Said stars then turn up with their teeth gleaming in American style and shine their stars beneath the Californian sun. You can think perhaps of this particular occasion as an Erasmus Forum induction into our own Hall of Fame, because we have a true transatlantic star of history and of economics in the person of Deirdre McCloskey, and we're gathered here to welcome Deirdre to the Erasmus Forum as its latest fellow. She's, as you all know, a distinguished professor of economics and history at the University of Chicago in Illinois, and she reminds me that she's lately become a senior scholar in the Isaiah Berlin School Chair of Liberal Thought at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. I've also had to promise not to crack any jokes at the expense of the late Isaiah Berlin, that Paganini of the lecture hall, as Michael Oakeshott, late of this parish, used to call him. The theme this evening, and it's a very bold theme for a lecture that's being delivered at, of all places, the London School of Economics, is the near impossibility of policy. Because if ever there was an institution associated with policy, it's the LSE. Policy associated with Stanley and Beatrice Webb, and William Beveridge, a native with certain measure of amusement that there's a beverage cafe in this distinguished establishment. So not just founder of the welfare state, passionate eugenicist, but also big in catering. Policy surrounds us everywhere.
Yes.
It's left wing, it's right wing. There are policies that are short term, designed perhaps to get a certain prime minister off the ropes by acclaiming the reintroduction of the imperial system of measurements at the expense of the metric system. We'll see how that pans out over the next couple of months.
I hope the imperial, because I learned pound, shillings, pence, and I haven't really adjusted to the decimal.
Well, there we are. Your hour is come. We'll put you in touch with Deirdre for a latest policy seminar on that one. But Deirdre's thesis, as I understand it, and you're about to hear quite a lot more about that, is that it's not so much a question there are good policies or there are bad policies, but the attempt at policy itself is doomed to failure.
Yes.
And therefore, that the world that we've all grown up in, when we think about the policy, is really futile and at naught.
Yep.
Now, we're looking forward to what Deirdre has to propose as an alternative to all these policies, and why it's the near impossibility of policy that she's adopted as her theme. Ladies and gentlemen, Deirdre McCloskey.
Thank you very much. I do stutter, as does Joe Biden or Marilyn Monroe or Winston Churchill, so I hope you'll accommodate your ears to that. I'm so glad to be back in these precincts. I was a student here on a traveling fellowship for a year in the glorious days of 1967, 68, swinging London, and The school was grotty then and smaller, and to be in this this marvelous space is good. We're in an age of policy and have been for a couple of centuries. And I'm hoping to shake your confidence that policy is necessary or desirable, or as my title says, even possible in all kinds of ways. Understand that having economic policy to solve social problems is a modern way of talking. In the 18th century, no one viewed poverty as a problem. And it certainly wasn't considered the responsibility of the French or British government to do much about, say, poverty, or for that matter, smoke pollution, or anything else. And I would argue that the idea of policy, and I hope this will undermine your confidence in it, is French. It's the French path of the Enlightenment. We're all children of the Enlightenment here, thank God. And the reason half of the Enlightenment, the idea, as Tom Paine said, that we have the power to build the world again on the basis of reason, the age of reason as he called it, is the French part of the Enlightenment. The other part is the liberty part. And that's more, now obviously they were interested in both of them, that's Scottish. And I highly recommend the liberty part of the Enlightenment, which I think made the modern world. And I have deep suspicions, as I hope I'll be able to persuade you of, that the reason part is applicable to social problems in any very convincing way. Now, the first point is that policy is regularly, and as an economist I'd say, almost always incompetent. That the state, when it undertakes to control increasing rental costs in London, wants to impose rent control, that's an incompetent policy and ends up causing the opposite of what it intended to cause, namely ample and cheap housing. Indeed, a few before COVID, our whole lives are before and after COVID. Before COVID, I was speaking on a panel at the National Theater south of the river here, and I said to the largely left-wing crowd, I said, you know, the scarcity of housing and rents and so forth and rental properties in London is caused by planning permission, and they booed me. And I was not alarmed, or I didn't break down weeping or anything, but I was quite not pleased. I expected that. So I could spend the next couple of hours, we could all think of many examples of incompetent state policy. I was once a socialist. When I was here at the school, I was just extracting myself from that persuasion slowly. But I remember at the time, with Vietnam going on in a fierce way, I said to myself, as I think quite a few people of my generation did, if a state can't even do one of its central, shall we say, comparative advantages, namely war, competently, can it do other things competently? I can mention here Suez, I can mention Gallipoli, so in war, the state is often incompetent, but it's also largely incompetent in its management of the economy. And there are reasons for this incompetence. Look, we all have to manage our own lives. We all have to plan in our own lives. But anyone who's lived knows that the best laid schemes of mice and men gone off to clay, that even in our own lives, we plan the day or the month or the year or our lives, and they don't work out exactly as we thought. We use that analogy of individual planning to make it seem obvious that the state should plan our collective lives. And this, I say, factually, often doesn't work out, and is, to some degree, I think, a fool's errand, a mistake. It's not necessary. The age of policy does not need to continue and expand into the future, as I think most observers of society think it is going to and should. Now, one reason that planning, direction, steering of the economy and the society, or war, doesn't work, is that we don't know. We're ignorant. We don't know, for example, the present very well. This is a point that a former professor here, Friedrich Hayek, made in 1945, if not before, that the knowledge we need to steer the economy or the society is in fact distributed among the individuals in the society and is not available to the wise men and women of Whitehall. It's particular to us. I know what kind of ice cream I like. I like vanilla, generally, pistachio, if I can find it. And some people like chocolate. I can't understand why they have this strange affection for chocolate ice cream, but all right. They know what they want. The central planner does not. And I don't need to go into the details of attempts to make central planning work, especially in Eastern Europe or China under communism. So that's the first problem, is this ignorance even about the present, about our present situation. What are the facts of the world right now? What's the situation in the housing market of London? You could get a little bit of insight with aggregate numbers, but to know exactly what you want in housing and what you want, you need to be you, and you. And you express that in the standard way that another Marshall, this being the Marshall building, Alfred Marshall pointed out in supply and demand curves. So we don't know the present. In our own, even come to think of it, of course, we don't know our own preferences. At least I don't. I have a closet full of clothing which would make this point vividly. You just look at the skirts I bought that are ridiculous for a 79-year-old woman, even for a 69-year-old woman when I bought them, and there they are. So we're exploring our own preferences and indeed our own production possibilities, as economists say in their jargon. And that's true of our social possibilities, our linguistic possibilities, our intellectual possibilities, even in the present. But then, of course, notoriously, we can't predict the future. Now, of course, there are things we can predict about the future. On Friday, the Queen will go to St. Paul's. Yet we don't even know how she's going to get up the stairs, but still, she's going to go to St. Paul's. We know the sun will come up tomorrow in this. We also know that it's not coming up; the world is turning. But the things we don't know are things that someone could profit from in prestige or in money. If someone could predict the future of mathematics, she could become a great mathematician. If she knew what in 20 years would be the fashion or the discoveries in mathematics, she should apply to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and go there, because she'll do very, very well as a mathematician. And if we could predict the course of love, we could plan out our marriages to the last day. If we could predict the stock market or the business cycle, we could become rich, which is a serious objection to the claim that there are people in the Bank of England or in Whitehall or anywhere else who know what the course of the ups and downs in the economy are. Look, if I knew when the next recession was going to occur, I could make a perfectly hedged bet. I would take out a mortgage on my condo in Chicago and then try to get a second mortgage from the bank, plunge into the market in bonds or stocks, make a nice little fortune. And if I had this, a la Faust, having made a deal with the dark forces, or econometrics, to know what the future would bring, I could make endless money. In fact, Faust complains early in the poem, complains that he has all knowledge, all human knowledge, but he hasn't got guilt, as he says, no money. This is irritating to him. So he makes his deal. So the present is unknowable, the future is unpredictable in ways that we would, in both cases, both now and in the future, would need to know in order to steer the economy. When Queen Elizabeth came to this university shortly after the great crash in 2008, she said somewhat peevishly to the economists, "Why didn't you predict this?" But that's what people think economists can do. They think they're weather forecasters. And this idea that if they were so smart they would be rich and they're not, doesn't occur to the Queen or anyone else. So economists are constantly being asked to do this steering job, and I won't go into their emotional state, but they do accept the challenge and advise governments on what to do next in the economy, and they fail. They fail repeatedly. Now, look, I'm an economist, not a communist, to quote an old joke about Cuba. I'm an economist, and I admire economics as a historical way of thinking. After things have happened, I can offer you a very reasonable explanation for them. And modern economic growth, for example, I've written a good deal about this. I think I've got it right. And that's very nice. But I can't predict profitably the future. Because, not just because I don't know the present, but because there's, as it were, a Heisenberg uncertainty principle about social or economic predictions. If I knew in the old days, skirt lengths moved up and down, now they seem to go everywhere. But if I knew which way the skirt lengths were going to go next year in the 1950s or 60s, I could make a fortune in the rag trade. As a great philosopher and baseball coach, Yogi Berra, said, it's hard to predict, especially about the future. Turns out, interestingly, that Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, said essentially the same thing in almost the same words. So, the metaphors we use about running the economy or the society or the character of London or whatever, driving the economy, people say, steering the economy. Imagine you're in your auto. You can't see where you are. You can't see any of the instruments. You don't know how fast you're going. You don't know anything. And you can't see the road ahead. And now we propose to steer the car, the automobile. Oh, this is clearly local. This is Pazzo. This is insane. You're going to drive into the hedge. You're going to drive over the cliff. You're going to be killed. It's not going to work. And I claim that the same thing is essentially true of the plans we impose. We being the only we available is the state. The plans we impose on our lives, architecturally, economically, in diet, in clothing, in other ways. Now, the way that statism, which is what I'm arguing against here, is often defended by economists, is to say, well, but wait, the market that you admire so much, that I admire so much, the spontaneous order of the sort that we have in language, or in art, or most of science, or in our personal lives, our personal relationships, our loves, our clothing styles. These spontaneous orders are imperfect in the economy. Now, I counted them, and since 1848, economists have come up with 108 imperfections in the market economy. I've actually numbered them. You can find a paper on this. 1 through 108. Monopoly. Informational asymmetries. Tendency to mass unemployment. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Terrible imperfections. In the meantime, this highly imperfect economy has increased income per head in Britain by 2,000%, and in countries like Finland and Japan by 3,000 or 4,000%, measured conservatively. So use Yiddish syntax with imperfections like that. Who needs perfection? So there's something wrong about the economist's claim that goes like this. The market is imperfect. The state is perfect. Therefore, we should have policy. That's the syllogism that runs the minds of modern economists. And economists have become more and more enthusiastic about this in the last 100 years. Especially from the 1930s on, economists, unlike other social scientists, have taken on the job, as they see it, of inventing more and more policies. More and more policies. Every year, another policy, more acts of parliament, more regulations. Ah, yes, that didn't work out so well, so let's have some more. I could go on and on. In fact, on this matter, we could have sandwiches brought in and locked the doors, spend the next 8 hours talking about them. But for instance, among the convictions that support this among politicians and policymakers, and even among economists, is that business is easy. That it's easy to second guess people in business. Because after all, we classics graduates from Oxford are very smart, and so we can do this job, thank you very much. And you, poor fool, in a bank or in a business, you're not up to the task. Now that's the incompetence part of the argument. And there's a lot to be investigated there, factually and logically. But I claim that this project, the policy project, is impossible. That the best framework for our economy and our society is laissez-faire. When Colbert, in the late 17th century, came to the business people of Paris and asked them how the government could help them, they said, laissez-nous faire, let us do it. I imagine they were alarmed by his help. And that policy, after all, is the one we follow in these other realms, in music, in art, and in language. There's a French Academy that attempts to stop usages like le weekend, or le parking, or le computer, but it doesn't work. Language evolves, and the state can't manage it. And I think the same thing is basically true of a world of innovation. Indeed, if the economy were as static as most non-economists think it is, even though the evidence is around them, you look out the window and see that new building there, you see the new Marshall building, you see the novelties all around you, they still think of the economy in zero-sum terms, and they think it's fixed, and they don't want their cheese to be moved. If it were like that, then I suppose planning might be possible. If the economy were like the film Groundhog Day, a great and philosophical film, then we could know what was happening and what's happening now and what's going to happen tomorrow, and we could plan it perfectly. But if humans are creative, and they are, they've been allowed to be since the 18th century increasingly, then it's unpredictable. Now, my other complaint about policy, my other realm of complaints, or the list of complaints, is about ethics. I think policy, well, for one thing, policy is violent. Policy is coercive. There's no question about this. Max Weber in 1919 pointed out that the very definition of the state is that it has a monopoly of violence in a certain area, geographic area. And that's right. And we want it to have a monopoly of violence. We don't want oligopolies of violence. We don't want mafiosi running around coercing people. We don't want husbands beating wives. We want one police force and one set of criminal law enforced. And that's fine. I don't want to give you the impression I'm an anarchist, although I must say I look with anarchists with sisterly affection. But in order for policy to be policy, it has to be coerced. And I don't think most people really feel this as intensely as they should. But we're being coerced all the time. And that's all right when we're coerced not to cross the street against the light. That's for our own safety, and it's nice. I don't mind that, but we're being taxed, we're being regulated, we're being prevented. Take a minor example. The city of London is hostile to Uber, and the black cabs are very hostile to Uber, and indeed use their own violence and the violence of the state, the coercive powers of the state, to prevent Uber from disturbing their monopoly. Now, in some countries, like my own, Uber has made the value of taxi monopolies zero in a very short order. In Germany, it's illegal. Uber is. And so we're being prevented in Germany from having a ride in a car inexpensively. Now, there is a deeper philosophical point that I want to raise without answering in any very sophisticated way, which is that change hurts someone always. Again, to take the Groundhog Day example, if every day was the same as yesterday, and nothing ever changed, then no one would be inconvenienced by the change. If someone writes a better argument for laissez-faire than I can make, I'm made worse off. If someone proves a mathematical theorem more persuasive than my old friend here, he's made worse off. If someone wins a law case against the attorneys here, they're made worse off. And we accept the improvement of the better argument, the better theorem, the better building, the better product, the better this or that, by social agreement, by, as it were, a higher level social agreement, to have a liberal society in which people are encouraged to have a go. It's the absence of slavery, the absence of physical coercion by other human beings that characterizes the modern world. In fact, the first triumph of British liberalism was the abolition of the slave trade, and then the abolition of slavery itself in the colonies, and the earlier abolition of slavery in England itself. So the problem is that as an economist, I want to say, yes, that's good. Let's let people have a go, and if national income goes up, as it has dramatically since 1800, then that's a good thing for the poor, your ancestors and mine, and us, here we are. But because people are always hurt by change, whether it's coming from a market or coming from central planning, it doesn't matter. This is an old point about socialism versus capitalism, that in ideal versions of both, if ideals are being compared, they should come to the same conclusion, and do. Because there's this world of hurt out there, there's great opposition to change available. Protectionism, regulation, the supports of what I'm arguing against, which is the power of the state policy. Now, in the end, I make an argument against treating people as children. I call myself a Christian liberal. I'm an Anglican, if you care, and I feel, therefore, that we have an obligation to the poor and handicapped of the world. So this is not a kind of cruel social Darwinism that I'm advocating. But I'm advocating a world of adults, of people allowed to be adults, with help, but not treated as we were as children. We all come from a socialist enterprise called a family. I've taken no one here as children, has sent them out at 6 years old to work in the coal mines to buy their lunch. I hope you haven't, at least. In a family, it's from each according to her ability, to each according to his need. The socialist motto, and I wholly approve of it. But as adults, we put away childish things. And every political, social, economic policy, other than essentially laissez-faire, with law around it to keep people from stealing from each other, so on, so guidance from likely, except for that political economic philosophy, all the other philosophies treat people as children. There's a great speech in the Swedish Parliament, 1928, in which an important politician laid out the plan for Sweden in the future. Sweden was to become a national home. A national home. And then he described this home in family terms. We all love being in families. If our families were nice, and most of them are. And it's nice to be taken care of this way. But it's undignified if applied to adults. So all other political philosophies involve one or another childishness or slavery. And so in short, I'm recommending, here I'll end and we can talk about it, what I could call adultism. I think this will appeal to teenagers. They want to be adults. I want them to be adults. And we're going to invite them into a society of adultism. But its other name, its older name, is liberalism. The philosophy that Adam Smith, I always cross myself, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, recommended. Adam Smith called it the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. He was fierce against slavery, and I warmly recommend it. We're far from it now. The state is very big in the modern world, much larger than it was in Smith's time, or even a century ago, partly because of those people you mentioned at the London School of Economics, Sidney and Beatrice Webb in particular. But I hope if you're inclined to statism, I hope I've dislodged your thinking a little bit, made it a little less obvious to you that we should go on this way. And if you're not, I welcome you as a comrade in the ongoing adventures of adultism in the modern world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Deirdre, for that typically bracing accounts of the matter, spanning the centuries as you do with great glee and authority. And let's see how many in this audience have been converted to adultism in its various forms. I'm going to start by perhaps asking you to consider whether you are underestimating the strength of the human desire for security.
Yeah, I think I am.
And if policy, in its various forms, left wing, right wing, health policy, education policy,
right,
as well as economic policy, you've been talking about economic policy, but we might come on to all those other forms of policy later on. If they have been so significant a feature, well, I mean, it is what modern politics has been about. Is that because it answers a human desire?
Yeah, I agree.
And we get frightened very easily.
I agree.
And sometimes we're right to be frightened.
I know.
Because the world of the future is in principle unknowable.
Yeah, I know. I agree.
Then that is what the godfathers and godmothers policy offer us, is that degree of security.
Well, you know, it's true. It's true. In fact, I'm working on a book on English medieval open field agriculture. And indeed, my argument is that a lot of the peculiarities of this agriculture, which looks very odd indeed on first glance, are in insurance mechanisms. But what's strange about the last couple of centuries, and especially the last century, is that even though incomes have really enormously increased, people are still buying insurance at irrational levels. In the States, I hope it's not true here, on the TV you get incessant advertising about, now hear this, insurance for automobile repairs. So you're to buy insurance, and of course pay the insurance company more than what your repairs on average will be, in order not to be disturbed by a $500 or $1,000 bill to fix your auto. It's like having insurance for lunch. Lunch is going to come. To have insurance is likely mad. And so I accept the point that humans may not want to be free. On the other hand, I think it's, I'm going to go on encouraging them to want to be free. So I think that makes for a scope of human life that's wider. And in particular, it makes for the enrichment of us all. If there are all these people moving to a new part of the country to get to a better job, or starting a hairdressing salon in the neighborhood, which I really need, or opening a new factory, or thinking up a new way of making these bottles of water. Have you noticed, most people here are old enough to remember, these bottles were once very thick and heavy, and they've gotten thinner, that is the plastic, it's gotten thinner and thinner and thinner as they improve them. So I want the society to do that. I think that makes for a great artistic flourishing. It makes for a better human life. So whether, I'm from Liberty, and I'm here to help you.
May I ask?
Andrew, yeah, and then Chuck.
It's the same question that's already been asked by
Andrew, very nice to see
I may
you.
say so, you haven't answered, because of course we don't want to insure against lunch. And insuring to have your car mended is a ridiculous idea.
Yeah.
To have your car mended might cost you $500.
Yeah.
If you're a poor person in Philadelphia, for example, where all my grandchildren live, and you have a heart attack, you're going to die.
Yes.
If you're a poor person in London and you have a heart attack, you're not so likely to die. And the quid pro quo, I'm on your side. I'm an adultism. I love to have no regulations and all of that. But how do you protect the vulnerable person?
Well, I'm, as I said, I'm a Christian liberal, so I'm with you. I want to protect the vulnerable. And one way to do that is, I hesitate to use the word charity because it arouses irritation in lots of people. But charity hospitals work. And in fact, the poor in the United States, so far as healthcare is concerned, are rather better off than you'd think, because they can go to municipal, essentially charity hospitals, supported by taxation, I admit, and get excellent care, because the doctors and nurses like to be at these hospitals because the cases are so interesting because the poor have not gotten very good health care. Now I'm contradicting myself. And so the cases are interesting. So look, it's hard for us to imagine a world in which the state is not enormous and coercive. Let's take an easier case than healthcare. Roads. Right now, every road in England or France or Britain could be private. We could privatize all the roads if we wanted to, because it's very easy to charge for them now. You have a transponder in your automobile, and you get a bill at the end of the month like your gas bill. And the roads are priced as indeed so in crude way they are in central London right now. I was in London a few months after the first 20-pound entering central London tax was imposed, and it was wonderful. The buses ran on time, the taxis were easy. So I don't know, but it takes an act of imagination to imagine what a healthcare system that was actually private, although you may here be finding out what it is as the NHS gets into more and more trouble. But in any case, I would claim, on the basis of lots and lots of examples, that there are private options that don't seem possible, which actually are possible, and that work quite well. He had his hand. You had yours.
Yes,
Yes, thank you. Likewise, and I'm with you on
Yes.
the big picture.
Oh, very time.
But it's a similar sort of question, but it's really about the way you draw the line on policy. You'll be familiar with this sort of argument.
Yeah.
And I was very struck by at one point where you said you had sympathy for the amicus position.
Yes, I did.
Which I do likewise.
Yeah.
But also immediately after that, you then made a massive concession, in my view, which is about following laws, quote, for our own safety.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous position,
It
it strikes
is.
me, because once you've said that, then you open up the door for lots of other stuff. And then later on, you talk about Smith, Will Smith, you mentioned John Stuart Mill. I don't need to tell you. The principles of political economy start out as a stateful laissez-faire, but by the end of the book, he's made so many qualifications that principle.
I completely agree.
You're leaving with a state which is doing all manner of things. And I just think it's that, and then you also know the famous exchange between Keynes and Hayek, where Keynes pointed out to Hayek, the only thing we disagree about is where to draw the line.
Yeah.
And isn't that the problem? We can all
Yeah.
even take this, but it's that, and what we've seen over many, many years is that line has just been moved ever and ever and ever towards the state.
Look,
Isn't that it?
the,
So aren't you better off with sort of taking a sort of Melchizedekian position and then just simply against the state in totality?
I'm inclined towards Robert Nozick's position. His great book in 1974, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. But I point out that in subsequent books he softened it too. And I rather wish he hadn't. But, and it's true, the line is moving, and that's my point, that policy-itis has been growing. And I agree that it's for your own, I'm from the state and I'm here to help you, is a license to interfere with people. Psychiatrists, for example, here in the United States, are authorized to seize you and put you away indefinitely if they think you're going to commit suicide. Indeed, if you say you're going to commit suicide, whether there's any plausible case that you're going to, what's the word in Britain? It's sectioned, isn't it? In the United States, we have other vocabulary for it, but it's the same thing. And I've personally been a victim of that. When I decided to change gender, my sister, who was an academic psychologist, got judges to attempt to section me. They didn't succeed because I'm so obviously rational. But if I had shown up not looking too rational, had a few drinks or something, then I might still be in the madhouse. So, yes, we want to, it's like children. Obviously, we can't let a 3-year-old boy run in front of the tram as he's proposing to do. Not because he's suicidal, but because he's foolish and he doesn't know the tram will kill him. So his mother grabs him, exercises violence to stop him, quite appropriately. But the more you become an adult, I don't need to argue this with you, but I need to argue it with a lot of the people out there at the LSE, that, as you said, the line keeps being drawn further. Look at the Tories about the NHS. They opposed the NHS to begin with, and yet now it's heresy. If Boris Johnson was to announce that he was opposed, that he wanted to close the National Health Service, he would be out the next day. There would be a vote of confidence and he'd be out, I think. So the line is moved, and I want to move it back.
On this side of the...
Yes, on this side, on the right side, you might say.
Thank you so much. I thought your talk was very, very provocative.
Thank you.
For me as a biologist, but I don't agree with everything you say, of course. First of all, you are talking about predictability.
Yes.
And I want to go to what Hal was saying about security.
Yes.
See, I can make a prediction for you now.
Go ahead.
That race hatred, group hatred, hatred of somebody for language is going to persist forever and ever.
Yeah.
Because we need the security. The security involves two things. It also involves bonding with people like us, and hating people who are not like us.
Yeah.
So you can talk all you want about diversity and doing these things. It's not going to work, but it has to be taken account of in terms of policy, because hatred is going to be there all the time. It's a biological fact. So that's one thing. The other thing that I want to flag for you, you said about people not knowing the future, not being able to predict the future.
Yeah.
Well, there is one major policy decision which was made, which, funny enough, I was listening to 3-4 days ago, which was General de Gaulle's policy for vetoing the entry of Britain into the European Union.
For the what?
Vetoing Britain's entry into the
Yes, you
European
did.
Union.
Now, this is a document. This is a document worth listening to. It's worth listening to because it got every point absolutely right. And had he lived, he would not have allowed Britain into the European Union, for the consequences that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Let's start with group hatred.
Well, let's start with group hatred. And
Almost an encouraging place to start, I think. Yeah.
It's connected to Mon General's attitude, actually, to tell you the truth. But no, I agree. And then the question is, what should the state do about it? What the we?
This is a problem, yes.
And the trouble is that if you give the state the responsibility to cure hatred or to bring people along so they're sweeter, it's a problem.
But what I'm making the prediction.
Yeah, I understand.
That this problem will never go away. It's part of human biology.
I think it probably is. The us and we, the us and them. Yet there are there's personal development in people as they get older. I mean, from children. As they get older as children, they get better at dealing with other people. And one starts with a wholesale identification with your mother. You're part of this we, and then you have other children, and then at around 8 years old, there's been elaborate studies of this. Children are capable of exchange, of not dividing things, everything equally. No, I get half the water bottle and you get the other half. No, we'll exchange the water bottle for something else.
But that's a result of instruction.
No, it appears to be biological.
You mean it's spontaneous?
It appears to be
like
spontaneous.
spontaneous economic order?
Like language or spontaneous economic order. It appears to be, in terms I think we both understand, biological. But then the question is what to do further. And there's the problem of the line. We don't want the government to be, at least I don't want them to be instructing us in morality. I think that's something that should come from somewhere else.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, you appear to be totally despairing of making policy, yet some people might think it's, a natural thing to do. You use your imagination, try to manage things. And
Yes.
I tried to look for examples of where we have had policies which are still with us,
Yeah, that
which
have
I
worked.
think we wouldn't go back on.
Yeah,
I was thinking about, for example, in this country, the Married Woman's Property Act.
exactly, 1873 or whenever it
If you
was.
married a woman with considerable
Yeah.
property, it became yours if you were
Yeah.
the husband. I did think there's a suggestion they would want to change that.
Yeah,
And anti-slavery is another thing as well.
yeah,
Surely this whole process does throw up things which last. Not all of them,
yeah.
probably only a minority of them, I don't know.
But those two examples are excellent examples of liberal movements. That is moving towards more autonomy, more adulthood. For, as you said, the Married Women's Property Act, I believe it's 1873, 74, I can't remember when, was an enormous change. And by the way, I had a student who did a very interesting dissertation about it. And it changed the behavior of married women considerably.
But it was an act of parliament.
It was an act of
And
parliament.
therefore, in terms
Well, I'm
of
not
rights.
against, but wait, I'm not against acts of parliament that reduce the power of the community to coerce people. And that's what the married student, that's not.
Isn't it the trouble, isn't it the danger with your point of view?
Mhm.
That if you don't have the intermediate government
Mhm.
trying to make policy, you end up with powerful people
But
with invested interests.
I understand
who
you.
use whatever power they have for themselves.
absolutely, you and I can go on the picket line against the influence of powerful people on the government, but you and I can also go on the picket line against slavery and against the version of slavery that English common law created. So that's policy. As I've said, I'm not an anarchist, though I like them. I have friends who are anarchists, and they're very nice. But I'm not an anarchist. I believe there should be government, but the kinds of things the government should be doing should be liberating moves. For example, let's take a concrete example from my own country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the following one in 1965, I'm less enthusiastic about. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prevented Southern states from excluding black people from voting. And I say spinach, and I say to hell with it. I don't want them to do that, and either do you, either does anyone here want blacks to be excluded from the polity. And so, in fact, when I first came to as an adult to Britain, I'd been here as a child a bit. When I first came to England as an adult, we were startled to find in the newspaper, we were looking for an apartment. We ended up in Finsbury Park before it was fashionable. And we were startled that in the newspaper in or what are we talking about, 67, you could still in Britain say Europeans only for a rental property. And I think that's terrible, and it's not just I think it's terrible, I think England losing against New Zealand in cricket would be terrible. But I don't want Parliament to intervene to prevent it. But I do want them to prevent enslavements. Look, there's a phrase that I like a lot, and I recommend it to you. Equality of permission. Liberalism or adultism is deeply egalitarian. Adam Smith was. He was an egalitarian. He wasn't a conservative. He was an egalitarian. He didn't glory in rank and so on. He was not Burke. He was Adam Smith. And equality of permission is what we need. Not equality of outcome. That's Rousseau. And that leads to socialism and ultimately to fascism. No, we don't want that. And we don't want even what we usually say, that's a good idea, equality of opportunity, because it's impossible. Each of us had a particular set of parents, and I did a tremendously good job for which I get full credit, I think. I should get higher income and better positions, because I chose my parents so carefully. My father was a professor at Harvard. My mother was an opera singer. I mean, come on. What a great person I am. And so equality of opportunity is somewhat meaningless. You could make equality of, I don't know, you can give people money when they're 21 or something, make their economic outcome, but some people are smarter than others. Some people are more beautiful than others. And some people are biologically more healthy than others. But what we can do is equality of permission. So women should be allowed to be airline pilots.
Now, I'm looking at the back row here, and I'm wondering whether any of you are converts to Professor McCloskey's
I'm sure
way
they
of
all
thinking.
are.
Any takers?
They'll sign on.
Any takers from McCloskey? You're a taker from McCloskey.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
Tell us why.
Yeah. Tell me why you think she's got it right.
Well, in terms of her views on the possibility of policy, I like that she was talking about human unpredictability and how the economy, even though because the economy is not static, you cannot.
That's right.
I think that's yeah.
It's all shifting around.
That's right, of status in the sense that you get to do. So now look, here's the problem with the word freedom. It's gotten out of its cage and gotten too big. So I don't have the freedom to buy a Rolls Royce because I'm not that rich. I suppose I could sell my house and go live in my car or something. But I can't buy 300 square meter apartment in central London. It's beyond my ability. And I can't fly to the moon. And I can't do lots of things for physical reasons or economic reasons. But I shouldn't be prohibited from doing things that I can do. That's the key point. Equality of permission.
Okay. And any others along the back row? Any converts to McCloskey? You? Yes.
I saw the point about there's 108 infections in the market with you saying monopoly and tenancy and a ton of
Yeah.
a couple. If policy is impossible, or if you didn't use policy, then how would these not be prevented from getting worse?
Well, because I forgot to kind of finish the syllogism about the 100, or the argument about the 108. I have a paper about it, you can find it on my website. But the 108 have never been proven. You've been taught economics in the following way. first couple of weeks, you say, look, here's supply and demand curves of this man Marshall, this building is not named after. And then you see at the equilibrium of supply and demand, that's a good thing. And then the rest of microeconomics is about the imperfections. I've written a book, which you should read, called The Applied Theory of Price, which is structured exactly like that. Except I was a professor at the University of Chicago, which, by the way, I was at the big state University of Chicago until 2015. But I was at the University of Chicago for 12 years, and I taught the kids about monopoly and externalities and so on and so forth. But they're never been measured. This is really quite a scientific scandal. So it would be like a geologist who said, oh, I don't believe in plate tectonics, this nonsense. I've got another theory of the origin of mountains. The earth is like an apple that's getting old and it wrinkles, and that makes mountains. But then didn't provide any quantitative or empirical evidence that that's the case. Whereas plate tectonics has masses of evidence of failure.
And Tom,
Thank you.
Yes.
What's your view on monetary policy? There is the adage that the best cure for high commodity prices is high commodity prices. So should the Fed and Bank of England just go home and sit by the fire?
They should go home. They should be abolished. And in a sense, in a sort of implicit and silent way, they have been abolished. On fixed exchange rates, even roughly fixed exchange rates, the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve has no effect on inflation or interest rates. Interest rates are determined in the world basically by the supply and demand for loanable funds. And China is a big player, not because it's so rich, it's not, but it's rich enough, and its savings rate is 50% or 40%, some gigantic figure, because they're terrified of their own government. And they don't have old age pensions, and they don't have a national health service. So they save this enormous, out of their very rapidly growing income, they save a very high percentage. And that floods into world markets and keeps interest rates low. That's why real interest rates in the world have been so low for the last 15 years. So I think the Bank of England, it's a very nice place, I notice it over here, and it should be made into condos or something, or a theater, because it is a theater. So you can see I have somewhat radical ideas. The attempt to monitor the business cycle is a fool's errand. Because if we could monitor the business, someone who knew how to monitor the business cycle, I had an argument actually with the former, what was it called, the chairman of the Bank of England. What was his name?
Another case?
The Canadian.
Carney.
Argument wouldn't be quite the word. I was on a panel talking to him, and I made some of these points mildly, and he didn't get them. He didn't understand them, and I tried to explain them to him. He didn't understand it. So he thinks he's in control of something, and I don't think he's in control of anything. In any case, if Carney knew how to do it, how to steer this car that I mentioned, he would be rich. If you're so smart, why aren't you rich, proverbially, is a very good question to ask anyone. Look, in Hollywood they say nobody knows anything. What they mean by that is that if you make a film, I've mentioned Groundhog Day, if you make another Groundhog Day, you might make a fortune or you might not. Nobody knows anything. Yes,
Sorry.
well,
Go back quickly.
You may be aware that Mark Carney was known by some as the unreliable boyfriend because his signalling as to what he wanted the Bank of England to do with monetary policy never really coincided with what the Bank of England ever ended up doing.
well, you know,
Because he was up on, as you said, the road, he couldn't see the road and he was
well,
trying
but
to...
you know, he was just wandering from policy to policy, didn't know what he was doing, and that's good. That's probably better than him having some fixed EE-day fix. Yes, dear.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm just a bit worried about the tragedy of the commons,
Yeah.
and if we just have unregulated or less regulated development,
Yeah.
what's going to happen to all the green spaces, and
Yeah.
how can we prevent against people building things with watered down cement so that they'll
Yeah.
fall down in 20 years?
Well, it's this matter of imagining a world in which there's not planning permission, or as we call it in the United States, zoning. The city of Houston in the United States does not have zoning, whereas virtually every other city in the United States for the last 100 years or so has had more and more strict zoning. You can build factories here, you can't build them here, right?
Yeah.
You can have businesses here, you can't have them here. It turns out, just to take this one example, I don't think this is decisive, that Houston nonetheless looks more or less like Chicago.